right, so the next one we're going to look at is inside of Chapter 3. We're going to open up this Instant HUD 1 JPEG. And what we're really going to start looking at is ways that we can utilize items that aren't necessarily designed for graphic design, but it's a setup of things that we can start to bring in and use to create a look, a feeling of certain elements. So with this, we're going to go and pull this up. And the main reason why we actually have this is we want to be able to go in and use just what we see here as the light stuff. So we're going to use this and lay this over top of another image to give it that mechanized feel, look like motion. So really what's going to go into is the end product is there's an individual that's just sitting there curling a weight, and we're going to start talking about how we can bring this in there, again, mechanized. So we start to think about that first project, even bionic. So what are some things we can add in here to add to that feeling? So we're starting to talk about, instead of just that initial depth of a design, like, oh, look, it looks like this type of thing. What can we add to it to give additional feeling? If we start thinking about what we did with the Stone Age text even, adding that simple background texture, what does that do? Now we're starting to get layers. We're starting to build that depth as we go through it. And we also have other additional elements that allow us to start to tell what is the narrative of this. What do we want people to see? What do we want people to think as we get into it? So when we first open this up, we start to see that we have what appears to be this like navy blue texture going through the background. Well, we want to go ahead and cut this out because, again, our focus is going to be on just the white that is there. So we want to set this, and we're going to adjust this so that we can make the white pop and the background go almost to black. So as we choose this, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add ourselves in a gradient map to this. So as we go into add our gradient map, we need to think about what is it that we're going to do with it. What is it that we want to add in for this. So let's go ahead and set our colors to default. We're just going to make it black foreground, white background. That's because when we go and we start to work with our gradient or adding into our gradient map, what's going to happen is going to use those colors to build our gradient. So if we go down to the bottom of our layers panel and we click on our adjustment layers, we're going to go ahead and come in here and we're going to add ourselves a gradient map to it. So down at the bottom we see gradient map, not at the top where it says gradient, down at the bottom where it says gradient map. Once you click on that, what's going to happen is you're going to see that it adds this gradient map to it. Now we can go through and we can adjust it inside of here. The other thing that we start to work with is getting used to what are we using, what's happening with it. Now we go and we use the adjustment layers in the bottom of the layers panel. What's our difference? There's one thing that happens with this as opposed to the other way that we can go through and run this. It is non-destructive, which is correct. The second thing though, as we're going to work with it then, is because it is non-destructive, it creates an additional layer for us. So in this case, what we see here is we get this gradient map layer that shows up inside of our layers panel. So if you are working with something non-destructively where you want to be able to have control over this gradient map to make additional changes to this in the future, we can go through and we can use that setting down there. If we were to go in and instead of doing it at the bottom, if we were to go ahead and come up here to our image adjustments and choose a gradient map up here, what's going to happen with that is you're going to see that we don't get an additional layer over there. So depending on what it is that we're going through and we're working with, if you want to have control over it because you know you want to go back and are probably going to adjust it or potentially adjust it in the future, then you're going to want to have that extra layer. In this case, we are not going to go back in and adjust this later on because all we're trying to do is make the background as black as we can make it and the stuff that's white on here to be as white as we can make it so that we can go ahead and make a selection and extract that stuff out. So with that, if I go ahead and use my gradient map, which is set here, and I say OK, you'll see that instead of creating a new adjustment layer that comes up over there, it's just adjusting the layer itself. So as you're working, just decide on what you want to do. Do you want to have control over that? Now, could I apply that, had the background, done the layer, adjusted it, and then once I was happy with it, could I merge those? Yeah, you could do something like that too. It's just added steps. Because what we're doing, again, we're just trying to isolate what's here. So the same thing we go into doing a levels adjustment. Because remember, when we start to think about a levels adjustment, I'm just going to hit Command L. to go ahead and do a levels adjustment on here, you're going to see that inside of our levels, remember we're looking at what is black and what is white. So as we look at this is the black point, this is the white point. These are all of our grays in between. If you haven't used levels in this way, it's going to be a new way to kind of think about them. So anytime I move this over to the right, anything to the left of that is going to become black. As we come over here, then for this, we're going through and choosing what is our white point. So as I move that over to the left, anything that is to the right of that is going to become white. So what would happen if we move that too far over now is some of those values that are our nice grays, deep grays, become white. And then what we have for the mid one is our midline gray. So this is where we go through and we can adjust this. Now there are a lot of ways that we can use levels in a creative manner. Get different looks to it, different effects to it, because now if we take a picture of something, even what looks like black, there are going to be various grays inside of there. We can control what's there. So we almost get kind of like we have this white area over top of what now looks like a camouflage surface. So we could do something like that to create that effect, to get that look on it. So think about other ways that we can go through and we can ultimately use this. So the big thing here is we're going to adjust our black point just a little bit here to make sure that we get blacks. Bring this over to get more that is a white look to it. So where I'm looking is inside of this area over here. We're going to make sure, I'm going to move it over just far enough to where we don't get those breakdowns or additional grays showing up inside of there. So we're pushing for this to be as much black and white as we can possibly get it to be. So whatever comes in is coming out here. Now we don't want to move these bottom ones because you'll see as I move that over, it's going to change. So see the white becomes gray as we move that. So we want those still 0 and 255 on the lower part for the output. And we're just simply adjusting the other ones. I'm at 77 and then 1 for the gray. That's just mid-tone gray is just saying that mid-tone gray is still going to follow. That one value is directly between what we have for our white point and what we have for our black point. So these are what I went to. You maybe want to go farther or less. I like the way this looks, so I'm just going to go ahead and say okay. Now since we didn't do this as an adjustment layer to add this effect to, so we didn't do adjustment layer levels, we're working very destructively, but again, we're not going back to this. So since we know we're not going to go back to this, there's no reason to worry about it. I did leave the Adobe stock on this image. If you wanted to now, you could actually grab a black brush and you could brush it off if you wanted to. just saying if you want to. So what we have on here now is we've gone through, we've isolated this down and given us that real black and white look to it. Now if you think back to channels, channels go through and channels are similar to masks in the sense that what we see in here that is on there that is white is where we are getting that specific color. Of course, as we add RGB together, we get to white anyways. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over top of our RGB thumbnail. We're going to hold down Command and we're going to click on that. Doing so is simply going to go in there and load all of the pixels that are currently white. So with that selected, you should see your marching ants going around all of the white objects. Once we have that set, we can actually just go Command J, and that's our new layer via copy. And it's going to go through and it's going to copy everything that was selected. In this case, all of the white stuff. So if we undo the background, what you're going to see is we then have all of that come over and into there. Now, if you really wanted to, you could, again, go in and clean certain things up. If you start seeing lines that are on there that you don't think should be on there. And that's all stuff we can check and we can look at once we get into even the final layout of it as we put it all together. But what we're going to do with this, we're going to take this then with that layer 1 selected, and we're going to define a pattern for this, because the nice thing about a pattern is we can add a pattern into anywhere. So let's go ahead and come up here and edit, define pattern. Once again, it's going to show up on here. We'll just go ahead and call this HUD display. or element or whatever else you want to call it. And we're going to click OK. So now we have that in here, and this is defined. So now we want to use this. I want to use this somewhere else. Everything working?
Yeah, I just got a little lost.
That's fine. So once we have that set, just like before, we're going to go in there and we're going to start working with patterns, because the nice thing about it, again, is we can move this around and control what it is that we have. But we want to apply this to another document. So let's go ahead and do Command O for file open. And inside the chapter 3, you should find this instant HUD2 JPEG. And we're going to go ahead and open that up. I am going to do just a little bit of cleanup to this stock here, just because we're going to be placing the HUD down here in this location. Not worried about getting this perfect by any means. Edit. Yep, edit define pattern. Good enough for this. So like I said, I just went in there and cleaned that up just a little bit, because we're going to place the HUD down into that location. I'm not going to fix her arm. She's working on that anyways. So we've gone in, we've cleaned up what's there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new document just so I can control the pixel dimensions as we go through and we start to open things up. So if we look at this, anytime we've gone in and saved something to the clipboard, if we go in and we do File New, it's going to show up inside of here. So you're going to know the dimensions. So the dimensions of what we selected for the HUD are 1056 by 528 when it comes to pixels. But we're going to come in here and create ourselves another document that is 2000 pixels by 1000 pixels. And I'm going to set my resolution. I'll just go ahead and set it at 150. That'll work for us. If you wanted to, there's also the custom one we made before, which shows up on here. So there's 2000 by 1000 pixels at 300 pixels per inch. So if you wanted to, you could also simply click on that. We're just going to create ourselves a nice new document, and then I'm going to bring over what I had cleaned up from this other one. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on it. I'm going to click duplicate layer. Now this is something that I use regularly that other people don't. But when I duplicate the layer, what's going to happen is here in the destination, we can decide where is this going to. So many people don't even know that it's able to do this. We can duplicate out of any file that's open, and we can send it to any other open file or make a completely new file from it. So I'm going to go ahead and take that and send it over to that untitled one that I just made. So it's going to come up as that. And I'm going to go ahead and call this, you know, what do we want to call it? Sure, woman. And say, okay. So now what's happened with that is we've just gone through and we've copied that over inside of here. Now it's going to come in based upon the size that it was in the other image. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a hold of the corner of this, and I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. And we're going to go and move this up. Essentially, in a lot of ways, we're going to get it up here to go in, and we can de-identify who it is. So we can kind of set this up knowing where our graphic is or what we're dealing with. So what we're trying to do is we're going to take the graphic that we've created, and we're going to place that circle part of the center of that right side gear swing thing, the circular object, at the elbow. So we can use what that drawing was to kind of simulate what we have for this machine that is operating. So make sure you give yourself enough space for that. Now, however much space that is going to depend again on how you choose to place it. So I'm going to bring it in something about like this. I think it's going to work for me. You can move it over to the left if you needed to the right if you needed to. If you wanted to scale it up so that she's larger, you could still do that too. So we can still grab that, and we can move this around until you get a look that you want to work with. Remember, as we're working with that, we see the bounding box on the outside of it. That's showing us how large the image currently is, so it does allow us to freely move that around. Once you're happy with that, we can go ahead and hit return, which is going to go ahead and allow us to commit that transformation. So now what you should see is something that looks like this. So now what we want to do is we want to have control and be able to apply what we have for that that graphic that we went in and built. So let's go ahead and let's create ourselves a new layer. And we want to go ahead and we're going to fill this layer with that 50% of gray. So with that layer one selected, we're going to hold down Shift and hit Delete. This just brings up our fill menu. On there, it says, what do we want to fill this with, contents-wise? Most of the time we go through and build this, most of you are probably putting things together using a foreground, background, or you can go through and choose color in here. What we also have down here is a black, white, and a 50% gray. So this allows us to go in and choose what we're going to ultimately be working with. We're going to be adding in a pattern to it. So when we go through and we start to look at what we're dealing with, and the color isn't going to be as much of an issue. But we're going to choose 50% gray. And we're going to go ahead and click on OK. So it's going to go ahead and we're going to fill this with 50% gray. So now it comes in there. When you first do this, you're probably like, why did we do that? We can't see anything. That's because we are actually going to take this individual layer that we have here then, and we're going to go ahead and do that pattern overlay. So we're going to add the layer style, pattern overlay. It's going to go to the content then, focused on what we have in here. So again, effects, pattern overlay. It's going to default to the last pattern that we used. That last pattern that we used was our stone. So let's go and click on that, and you should see right next to the stone, there's the other user identified. We're going to click on HUD display. You're going to see that that shows up on there. Now right now what's happening with that is we're dealing with looking at it from a scale standpoint. So that is in there. That's the size of it. So if we go through and we start to move this up, you'll see that we can adjust how large is that. And we can start to drag around the same thing like we did before. That individual pattern tile. Now, depending on what you're working with, that's why when you're dealing with devices or looking in books and learning from those, what numbers that somebody else may have may or may not work for what you have for your design based upon just resolution alone of your document. So as you start to work with that, it's important to understand what are the additional tools, controls, and features inside of these panels that we can use and what are they doing. So don't be afraid to play with them. Don't be afraid to see exactly how is it working, what's happening with it as we go through and use it. So right now we're set on normal. We're going to go ahead and change this normal blend mode out of here, and we're going to drop it down here to overlay. And then we're going to start to look at what's going to happen with our opacity as we go through to play with this. So we're going through, we're going to start to adjust what we have on it. So up to this point, though, as you're looking at it, you might say, well, I still can't see anything through there. And that's because right now when we go through and we're working with this, we still have that background. So even though we put it on here, it's still using what is transparent is on the pattern. We're still seeing the color behind there. So we chose a 50% gray. So as we go through and add that, we're seeing then the pattern over top of it. How can we get rid of that? Well, if we go in here and we start to look at what we have for blending options. Now, this is something that we have done very, very little with up to this point. We've talked about it. We've hinted at it when it comes down to other places inside of Photoshop in the basic Photoshop class. But we have this area up here at the top where we start to see fill opacity. That's based upon how opaque is the fill of that individual layer. Well, what happens when we start to back that down? We now can see through there. So that gray that we chose to use is in there. But as we back that opacity down for the fill opacity, we can drop that all the way down. And now we're able to get rid of that background color. And that's just under your blending option. So even in the layer style, as we bring that up, you can use that. If I come in here to this pattern overlay and I uncheck the pattern overlay, notice that I can still use that control. So when we go in there, we start looking at dealing with layer styles. Don't forget the control of this. This can work for a lot of different things as we go through and use it. We're going to use this pattern overlay. Now we can't come out here. Remember, we can drag this stuff around as we're working out here. So we can decide how large do we want this to be. If that's big enough, you could stay there. If not, we can always come in here to our scale. And I can go ahead and I can start clicking the up arrow to increase the scale. I can drag this out. And we can continue to increase and decrease that until you get the look you want. And this is where keeping the mouse out over top of the keyboard can work. This is where using two hands. So going in, and I can use, for me, it's the right hand on the mouse, the left hand on the arrow keys, while I continue to adjust the scale until I get to a point that I'm happy with. So I'm sitting on for the I went to overlay with opacity. That's controlling what we're seeing in the white. So how opaque is that white part? All the way up, you'll see this is at maximum. We can go and we can back that down a little bit. We can back it all the way down and you see nothing. So we can kind of work with this to decide what is it that we like. Do we want it all the way up? Now, all the way up, I think it's a little too pronounced on like the skin tones. It doesn't bother me on the gloves and stuff, but on the skin tones. So even with that set, I can sit here and start hitting the down arrows until I get down into a range that still gives me the look that I like. So I'm at 71%. And what you want to watch is you want to watch here in your shadow areas. Are you still seeing that? How does it work to blend itself out away from there? What are we seeing with the other items? So once you get to a point, I'm looking at that from a motion standpoint, still thinking about actual physics as we start dealing with the anatomy and physiology. How's that moving? What's happening as it moves? So we're getting that swing to that. So once you're happy with the way that looks, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say OK on this. And then to add just an additional effect to it or another point to it, let's go ahead and let's grab our type tool and let's add some text to this. So we're going to go ahead and add some precision text. Since we were working in here, notice all of our settings over here in our character are retaining from the last time that we worked in this. So you may find yourself having to come in here and adjust some things. So I'm going to stick with Arial Black because I actually still like the way that this looks. Yep, I'm going to stay with Arial Black. So we're going to come in here and we're going to place our text over here. And actually, I'm happy even with the size of my text. So once we have our text on here, we're going to go ahead and change the way that our text ultimately looks. So for this, I want to actually go in here. And for my text, we can add to this. Maybe we want to just go in and change what the opacity is a possibility. So maybe you want to just drop the opacity down so it starts to blend with what is there. Maybe we want to add to this. So we start to look at what we have for our text that's on here. Maybe we want to make some other changes to this. So we want to come in here to our effects. What effects do we have available to us? To play up with the whole line that we have for the swinging of the arms, maybe we want to come in here and add a stroke to this. In this case, I'm gonna add a white stroke to it. Structure deals with the size. How large of a stroke do I want to have? Position to it. Where is this stroke actually going to be positioned at? Outside, inside, center. Now, if you start to see some changes, to remember I was playing around with the opacity down here on this. If I say OK and I come back down here and I adjust the opacity back up, because I've added a new thing to it, I go like this and add the opacity back up. What are we getting for that? What's happening with our stroke? So there's the stroke on it. What's the actual color of our text? All of these start to play into what is it that we are going to have with this. So I have a text color down there. I have a stroke color. If I put my stroke to center, if I start to back this down, we'll start to see less of the stroke. If I go down here and I look at my text, what is my text color? My text color was white. So what if I change this to a gray? What's that going to do to my look? So as you begin working with that, you're going to see there's different effects, different controls, different things we can go through and work with. What happens if we change just a simple blend mode down here? So I start to drag this across here. What are we going to see with what's happening with our blend modes for this? So what's the look that you want to have? Do you want a screen look to it? Maybe you want a screen set up and then you want to go ahead and drop that opacity down just a little bit so then we start to see it blending with what's behind there. All of these are tools. All of these allow us to go in and start to get different feelings with it. If I take it to overlay, I may have to bump my opacity back up. But what's that doing with the white versus the gray that's in there? Maybe you start to look at your text color, and instead of being that gray, you want to go to something a little bit darker. Maybe you want to go with something a little bit lighter. You can see all of these settings, all of these things that we control impact what we're getting as that final element. So as we go and we start using blend modes, white is no longer white and black is no longer black. So as you start to work with it, if we start to change again, text color, what's happening if I take this, if I take that all the way to white, what happens with it versus what happens on my stroke? So as you start to work with the colors, you start to play with what's available to you in those layer styles. Don't forget what all is in there. Because as we start to work with any of these are all things that have actual capabilities to them. So we look at bevel and emboss. What happens in there? What are the options? We're using stroke right now, but what happens with the alignment of that stroke? If it's inside, where does it go to? If it's outside, what does it look like? If you're actually on center, it's going to put half of it in, half of it out. What does that look like? We start getting its shadows. What happens with our shadows? What are the functions that are available inside the structure of an inner shadow versus an inner glow? What happens with the satin? So we start dealing with satin overlays. What's it going to do to that? Color overlays we use, gradient overlay we use, pattern overlay we used. What happens when we start looking at outer glow? And we start adding to that. What's going to happen with that? Now we're dealing with text right now, so we start looking at what we're selecting and what's happening with it. Do we have something outside of that? Can we even write outside of that? And then lastly, of course, coming in and starting to deal with drop shadow. And what are the effects and what are the controls of those pieces? So as you go through and you start to work with it, Get in there. Start looking at the stuff. You know, here we went from something that started out as, let me go ahead and revert this. Something that started out like this, and in the end, we were able to go in and turn it into this that goes here by simply overlaying it on a basic photo. We add a little bit of text. Now we have those depths to it. We can look at it. We have the precision that's based upon the way we treated it. The precision's all the way in the front. We step back a layer and we can see then where we have that HUD display that we have, and then it falls back behind that into the image. Something that doesn't take a lot of time. We have full control over it, so we still have that pattern overlay. If I want to come in and move the pattern, I can come in and move that pattern. If I wanted to nudge it just a little bit, or I don't like the way it's sitting, I want to move it up a little bit higher, we still have that control. We have the control to come in here and scale that as well. But it gets to the point where we start to weigh, what is it that we're doing? Do we want an adjustment layer, or do we want to just make an adjustment to it? So are we working destructive or non-destructive? And it all comes down to what type of control do you want to have and where is that going to? We knew that HUD was going in to become a pattern. We only wanted the white. So when we went through and we adjusted that and we did that to it, didn't matter because we knew that we weren't going back away from it. So as you start working with stuff, stop looking at things just as they currently are and begin to think about what can we do with those. As you start to see textures, taking photographs of textures. If you're carrying around your cell phone and there's something that's kind of neat, pick it up, take a picture of it. You can use that later on. Anything, concretes, look at textures from carpets, fibers, metals. Taking pictures, starting to build yourself a library of things that can become patterns, but also things that can become inspiration when we start looking at creating even what we have as visual textures, not the actual tactile, physical textures that we're going to go through and touch. Think of sandpaper and that. But then also play with them, because if we go back and we start to think about how we've used patterns in the past, changing a blend mode can give you an entirely different look of an object as opposed to what you initially intended it to be.